Hosting the Author Studio, the Edina Arts Center is a jewel in leafy Roslyn Park in the city of Edina. It showcases the Peggy Kelly Media Art Studios, the Margaret Foss Gallery, and the Clark Gift Shop. We have a full-service media transfer department where our staff is close enough to keep your projects simple. Our gallery offers many shows throughout the year, including our annual Members Juried Show in the fall. The center serves over 5,000 students and guests each year and offers classes in painting, drawing, jewelry, photography, writing, and many more. Our pottery department features 15 different kilns, and we're known as the biggest little pottery department in Minnesota. At the Edina Arts Center, we live up to our slogan of, "Every day, I need art." Now sit back and enjoy this episode of the Author Studio, hosted by Colin Nelson. Well, good morning, and welcome to the Author Studio. Welcome to the Arts Center, Edina Arts Center. My name is Colin Nelson. I am the host of the program here, and I would like to encourage you, if you have time after the program, to wander around this interesting building. As you can see, we have art crammed in every corner. Also, if you have time, stop at the gift shop. We like to buy local. The local artists that offer their products in the gift shop are wonderful. You're going to find some great prices on local jewelry and artwork in the gift shop. And then finally, please pick up one of the brochures in the lobby, or out in the gift shop, I should say. We offer memberships, classes, seminars on a variety of different art forms and encourage you to participate. You do not have to be an Edina resident to participate in any of the activities here. So we welcome you to do that. My book, Flashover, is just out. It's a suspense mystery. That's for sale, and Roma's books will be for sale also. For those of you that are new to the program, I'd like to pass around a sign-up sheet. If you would give us your email, please. We would appreciate that. We can keep in touch with you about future programs. Thank you. Whoops. We have with us today Roma Clatayud-Stocks.
Very good.
Did I say that correctly?
Yes, very good.
This is her first book in a trilogy. It's called A Song in My Heart. This is such a unique book. I have only seen this kind of an arrangement, which I'll talk to you about in just a second, in maybe one other book in my entire life. Not only is this an historical piece of fiction, but there's an entire CD that comes with the book that Roma composed and recorded, and it goes with the story. So we're going to talk about that. Very, very unique. Let me tell you a few things about her before we start. This book won second place in the Best Novel Historical Fiction at the International Latino Book Awards. It was the recipient of the Midwest Book Awards' first place in the arts category, and probably most important, Mom's Choice Award in Multimedia Experience for Adults. One other interesting thing about Roma is she was actually here in 1994 as an artist. And was it second place, Roma?
Yeah,
that
second
you won
place.
second place in the juried art show. You've heard of the term the Renaissance man? This is the Renaissance woman. Anyway, thank you for coming, Roma.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here, and thank you to all of you for being here.
Let's talk a little bit first about you, because I think you have as interesting a story as your book. You're from Mexico originally.
Yes, yes.
How did you get to Minnesota?
Well, I had three options. I always have fun with this because I wanted to come and go to the university. And I had the option to go to California and Texas or Minnesota. And any of those three places would have been wonderful, except that one time we were sitting at the dinner table back in Mexico, and my brother, who is very well read and everything, he says, you know, you should go to Minnesota. It's the state of 10,000 lakes. And it's a true story because I love water. And I said, you know, I've been to Texas, I've been to California, I've never been to Minnesota. So yes, Minnesota it is. So that's how I ended up here. And then fortunately, just a few months after, I met my husband, and who is from Minneapolis, and stayed. And that was 30 years ago.
You have two adult children.
I have two children, yes.
One just got married.
Just one got married 2 weeks ago.
Wonderful.
So congratulations
Wonderful.
to him and his lovely wife.
How did you get started writing? What motivated you to do that?
You know, it's interesting because I've been asked that question many times. When I was a little girl, I started writing. I would write short stories. However, I sort of went into the music side of the artistic life because I started taking piano lessons at 10. And then back in my teens, I continued writing, but it was more poetry, philosophical thinking, things like that, but still wasn't really thinking that I was going to be, you know, writing a novel. But then in 2002, I was working on a project with the Minnesota Orchestra Volunteer Association, in which we produced a concert at Orchestra Hall where we showcased the music of Latin composers from the late 1800s to the present. And as I was doing the research for the program, I was really inspired by that time in history. And I said, you know, it would really be interesting to write a novel, a narrative about this time in history, because it's just so, you know, the turn of the 20th century is just so vibrant. So that was sort of the first step. That was when I decided that I wanted to. So, well, I had gone to school at the University of Minnesota for music and psychology. I ended up going back to school at St. Thomas University to learn the craft of writing, and particularly focused on historical fiction writing. So from that point on, I sort of then started to, you know, to write the narrative, and began also a very profound work with research in terms of the story, because it was very important for me.
Now, this is a story about a young woman, and actually that action takes place in Mexico, New York, Spain, Germany, as I recall.
Not yet.
Minneapolis?
Not yet. I'll tell. It's the story of Alejandra Stanford, who is born in Minneapolis of 1902. So she is, her father is American and her father is Mexican. So as she's growing up in Minneapolis, she's obviously experiencing the intermingling of all these various cultures that are coming into the United States. But she finds that music really is the perfect expression of her own artistic inclinations, emotions, and ambitions. And so she's inspired by Minnesota's musical pioneers, whom were German, because at the turn of the 20th century, the largest ethnic minority to come were Germans, and they were very influential with the music. So, and she's also obviously inspired by classical composers and Beethoven and Mozart. So, despite the fact that she is living in a time where women perhaps were not as much part of the music orchestras, she is compelled and she is determined to become a world-class conductor. So the story takes place here in the Twin Cities, in New York, in Mexico, and in several cities in Europe, including Italy and Spain and London. I mean, England.
Yes, yes.
So.
Why did you said you started with music, but why did you choose writing for this story?
All right, well, because I started with music, but something interesting would happen is that when I would sit down to write music at the piano, I would just imagine all kinds of stories to go with the music. So And I was like back in 1998. So, I would think, somehow I have to find a way to incorporate music and then these stories that are sort of coming into my head. And then 4 years later, that's when I had the experience in 2002 with the Minnesota Orchestra Volunteer Association. And that's where I had the idea then to write the narrative. And then in 2003, the Minnesota Orchestra was celebrating their centennial celebration, and that was the year that Osmo Banska came aboard, and he was the conductor. And I said, well, what if I tell the story from a woman's point of view? And in this way, I can merge both the narrative and the music. And to do that, of course, the character had to be a musician, and in this case, she's a pianist, and she's a budding composer. So that was the way for me to sort of bring in the original music, because she is a composer in the story. And of course, she's inspired by everything she sees and hears and experiences.
What gave you the idea to put a CD with the book? I started to say, there was a biography of a jazz musician years ago, and I can't remember which musician, but included in the book was a CD of his music.
Right.
It's very unusual to have a novel with music.
Well,
how'd you get that idea?
Well, I think it was because I had done a CD first back in 1998, and so when I came up with the narrative, I said, how can I incorporate both things together? And so that was kind of, I had the background with the music, with having done a CD, and then with the narrative. And so the idea was that by her being a composer, then I could integrate the music. I had also seen it done one time, as you said before, also with a friend of mine who did a book on the life of the Spanish composer Granados. And so he had a CD of the music of Granados. It was a little bit different in that case than in mine, because in mine she was actively writing and composing the music as part of the story. So it was sort of a very natural process for me to be able to incorporate, the CD, the music, with the story, weave it through her life or through the story, the narrative.
Yeah, well, it was a wonderful success.
Thank you.
This is Hispanic Heritage Month, which I'm sure you all know. How accurate is your story about an Hispanic woman that comes to Minneapolis in 1902?
Okay. Well, the character is fictional, but I was really drawn to myself, in terms of my own reading, into historical fiction. And part of it is because it's very important for me, if I'm reading something, I like to learn, and education is very important for me. So it was essential that everything around the character was based on history. So everything around the character, all the dates say that she attends a Minnesota Orchestra concert, because the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra was actually founded in 1903. So everything surrounding the characters is all based on facts, it's all based on historical data. And all the artists that I talk about, obviously,
are true.
Real
people.
All are real people. Emil Oberhofer, who was the first conductor of the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. Back then it was called the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. Anais Schoen-Renee, who was perhaps the first woman conductor of the United States, and who also was very influential in developing the curriculum for the University of Minnesota School of Music. And of course, I tried to also tell in the story anecdotes about composers, whether it's Mozart or Franz Liszt or some of the Mexican composers that compose beautiful waltzes. So I really tried to be as accurate as I possibly could through the research that I conducted.
You had street names and different buildings were located at certain spots. How did you do all of that research?
I took every book I could possibly have. I started obviously with Minnesota because the whole is this Alejandra Stanford. She's Minnesotan. She's American. So I also wanted to bring out the contributions. We're talking the turn of the 20th century. This is a very vibrant period, the Gilded Age, when money is pouring into a lot of the cities. As a result, many of these magnates, Pillsbury, James J. Hill, they are putting money to cultural institutions. The Minnesota Orchestra, Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra in that case, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. So I really also wanted to highlight the contributions of all these Minnesotans or wherever she was. I mean, if she's in New York, I'm highlighting New York. If she's in Spain, I'm highlighting Spain. If she's in Mexico, I'm highlighting. So I kind of, a lot of it is research that I did. A lot of it also were things that I've learned in my own career in the last 15, 20 years of working in arts organizations. So a combination of things.
How long did it take you to do the research?
The research probably took me about a couple of years, and then, but in some ways I say also a little bit a lot of my life, because as an author you tend to write what you know and what you're familiar with, and a lot of times you don't realize how many of the things that you learn in different periods of your life stay in your unconscious, stay in yourself, and it's almost like a simmering process until it's ready to come out, and so I say it took most of my life, but then the condensed part in terms of Minnesota and other places, 2 to 3 years. But
so you could have written a book this thick. Instead, it's just...
Well, actually, it's interesting because that is why it's a trilogy, because when I came up with the idea, it would have been over 1,000 pages, and I decided, I had done
Maybe
little
not.
research, and most, average size of a book is about 300 pages or so. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to start with part 1, this first phase of the life of Alejandra, which is like from birth to her 20s, and then I'll continue to phase 2 and then phase 3 and then wherever God allows me to do.
How much of the story was driven by your research or vice versa? In other words, if you researched and found some fact that interested you, would that change the plot or the characters?
That was a very interesting situation that happened. So there were times where I had to research because I found it that the more I read, the more information I had in my head. When I sat down to write it, it would be easier. But there were times that, the imagination and the creative process sometimes takes you to different places. And then when I would write, different episodes or different segments, and then I would go back and do research on that particular time of history so that I could be accurate. And there were so many times that the history coincided with what I had written.
Really?
Yes. Huh. So that was kind of, one incident, for instance, is when the character happens to visit her grandparents in Mexico City, and she's there studying for a short period of time. I don't want to give too much away of the story, but she's studying there at the Conservatory of Mexico there. And as it turns out, she was a big fan of Beethoven. Well, that was the year that actually Mexico had their first Beethoven festival in 1920 and 1921. So I just felt like, oh my goodness.
All came together.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she's right there where she needed to be. So there were like little coincidences like that it just sometimes astonished me, and it was just fun.
Well, let's hear a little bit of the book, and then we're going to play a little of the music.
Okay.
So why don't you start it?
I'm going to just set the stage. This is when she is 13. Alejandra is 13 years old. And she had been visiting her grandparents in Mexico, and she had been living with them at the hacienda in Mexico. I don't know if you're familiar with the haciendas, but so I'm just going to read this short excerpt. The next day, there was a chilling silence in the hacienda. In the evening, after dusk, the skies were almost black, and Alejandra walked toward the music salon holding an oil lantern to guide her path. The heavy clouds made the night so grim and obscure as if the moon itself had disappeared. She entered the cold and dark salon, and as the chandelier was not lit, she placed the lantern on the piano and sat in front of it. Music had been entertainment to her in the past, but now she hoped the music would appease her, temporarily silence her cries. She remembered how a week ago her cousin Sol had been sitting next to her as she played Beethoven's For Elise, and he played back the first phrase. A cold breeze swept through the room, and she felt it on her shoulders. Her hands were trembling, and her tears fell onto the piano keys. She wiped her eyes and started moving her fingers through the keyboard, but continued to cry, now profusely, to the point where her vision became very blurry. Once again, she wiped her tears with her cotton shawl, but the sadness she felt moved her to continue playing. She wanted to play something soothing as she thought of her cousin's essence and all the happiness he had brought to everyone who knew him. She had improvised short musical phrases many times before, yet this time she slowly began to play a new melody. And then she realized she had put all her feelings into the music. She closed her eyes and whispered, "For you, Sol." She then stopped playing and covered her face with her hands as she let all her emotions out. A few moments later, she placed her hands on the piano once more, and note by note, phrase by phrase, a new waltz emerged. Vals del Sol, Vals del Sol. This was her first complete composition, a serenade inspired by her cousin. Music, for her, had taken on a profound emotional meaning. A few months later, in June, the Stanford family departed for the United States.
Now, in the book, you are instructed to play the CD, so I'll do that for a short time.
Oops.
Did it go on? There we go. Sorry.
Thank you.
I saw a few of you closing your eyes. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's shift a little bit and talk about the music.
Okay.
What was your first instrument? What were your first musical memories?
Well, my first musical memories, when I was 10, and my mother bought a piano, and right away I liked playing the piano. Right away I started taking lessons. But my earliest musical memories actually come also from my mother, because she is a huge classical music fan, and so she has a huge collection. And so every Sunday morning she would play classical music. And amongst her collection are waltzes. And I think I love waltzes. I love Strauss waltzes. But also, as I had mentioned earlier, at the turn of the 20th century, many Mexican composers wrote just beautiful Mexican waltzes. So I really wanted to be able to highlight that in the story. And in fact, the name Alejandra actually was inspired by a Mexican waltz by a composer by the name of Enrique Mora, by the same name, Alejandra. And so if you're wondering what that might sound like, you can go to my website, and I do have links to different kinds of music. And also, for those who love music, I put together in the index page a list of all of the music that I cite in the book. And again, the music can be classical, it can be jazz, it can be popular, because I wanted this character to be embedded in music. And music could be classical, but also we're looking at the early 1920s, early 1900s, and jazz was also very important to American history, American music. So there's a little bit of jazz and a little bit of popular music in both the selections chosen here and then also in the music in the city.
Well, in your book, there's a tremendous amount of intermingling between the European composers, U.S., Mexican composers, and that's all true,
yes,
right?
Yes, yes. Well, yes, because if you take, for instance, classical music, obviously the classical music, they're primarily sourced Germany, Austria, but as new communities are coming into different countries, as I mentioned before, you have a lot of the Germans coming into the U.S., of course, you have that influence. You have the influence not only with classical music, but you also have the influence of popular music, polkas. In Mexico, we had President Porfirio Diaz, who brought a lot of the European music, and so you had the influence of the classical music, the waltzes, and so that gets mixed in. You take a look at jazz. Jazz, obviously, you've got all the various kinds of influence, African roots, Latin roots combined, say, from Cuba, that really had a lot of influence on ragtime. Then ragtime had a lot of influence on jazz. So you really see how the intermingling of cultures influences, the music that ends up being developed. And of course, jazz, you have all that influence here as well.
What amazes me is you composed. Well, we just heard you wrote that.
Yes, I'm sorry, my microphone is down here. So I hope I did, and but I was also very fortunate. I had studied, took several classes at MacPhail Center for Music, and there I met a wonderful teacher who is also a composer himself and a producer, Chan Poling. I don't know, perhaps some of you have heard from him. And so I worked with him as I did in my previous project and in this project, and so he helped me to arrange the music. And he and other musicians of note from the Twin Cities perform on the CD.
So you originally wrote this for piano.
Right.
And you composed it. And
right.
But besides Chad, how did you find the musicians?
Well, some of the musicians I had either met, on various projects. Others Chan recommended, and also Chris Osgood. They were both, I consider them to be my mentors, back when I started to really get serious about writing music back in the late 1990s. And then we went into the process of recording the music. This particular CD has sort of the unique feature that when we composed it, when we recorded it, actually we did it on Chan's piano, which if you maybe recognized, it actually it was a 1927 piano. So that was one of those wonderful coincidences, because he didn't know when we sat down to record the music and arranged it. He knew I was working on a project. I told him I was writing a book, but he didn't know what the story was about. So one of the things, again, one of those coincidences that I was amazed is that when I went to his house in his private studio there, and as I sat down to record the music, noticed that he had this 1927 piano. So I said, how ideal. I didn't really want to change it because I really wanted to keep it as authentic as possible from that time period.
How many musicians are playing on that?
And that actually is just him and me, because in some of the pieces, oh no, let me take that back. No, that particular, I have to think about the various tracks. No, in that track actually is Nachito Herrera who is playing the piano,
Wow.
and the Aurora String Quartet on that
Wow.
particular track.
That's
So that
very
was
impressive.
a track that actually we recorded for 2002 actually for Latin Renaissance.
He plays quietly on that one. I've never heard him play quietly.
Well, because he usually plays
He's
his
pounding,
music,
right.
and so this was
Cuban music.
I had written the music, and we actually performed it live at Orchestra Hall for the Latin Renaissance event that I mentioned before, that we did in 2002. But then I really liked the sound, and so then we went to the studio with him and with the Aurora String Quartet, and then
Wonderful.
we recorded in the studio. And
Yeah.
so I decided, since that where the idea to write the book came about, I decided that I should start the book with this first track. So then I came up with the idea of how the character in the book composed it. It was in a particular sad situation where she composed it, but she wanted to also be spiritual.
Yep. The way the book is arranged, at the end of certain chapters, you're instructed to go to track 4 or track 5 on the CD.
Right.
How much of, this kind of goes back to the question I had about your research, how much of the narrative or the character was dictated by the songs, or vice versa?
Oh, that's
How
a
did
great
that work?
question. No, the narrative came first, the whole story. But since I already, some of the music I had already composed, and some of the other music, as the narrative came along, I composed new music. So it was, it was a sort of natural process that it just, however worked best for the narrative, then that's the music that I would use, if that makes sense. It had to fit in with the story. So the story was first, but then I was able then to navigate it so that I could also then include the music as part of the story. Because both the book stands alone, so you can read the whole story and really not necessarily hear the music, and you still go away having a complete story, and obviously you can hear the music alone too. But they do complement each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you were recording with these musicians, did you tell them the story, or
Nope.
it was
Nope.
completely separate?
No, yeah, completely separate. Because again, a few of the pieces I had recorded prior to even coming up with this idea, and afterwards, when I did have the idea, nobody had any idea about the book, because I didn't even know how it was all going to turn out myself. I envisioned it in my mind, but I did not want to say anything until the whole project was complete and see how it all was going to work out.
Should we listen to some more?
Okay.
Why don't you read another section?
Okay. So this is just to set the stage. As I mentioned, Alejandra was born into a privileged artistic family. So it was common for families in those days, which that was another reason I chose the early 1900s, because with no technology, music was at the center of people's lives. People would gather around the piano at the kitchen, and women were expected to play a musical instrument. So this is when she has just graduated from high school, and they are doing the grand tour through Europe, and they are in Spain. So she's been having a wonderful day in Barcelona, Spain, going through some wonderful sights. And so towards the end of the day, it was not uncommon for her, when she had the urge to play the piano and she was away from home, if she found a public piano where she could play at a hotel or whatever, she had been inspired, she would ask permission, she would play it. So this is what's happening. She's just returning to the hotel, asking permission, sees a grand piano in the lobby of Hotel Palace in Barcelona. And this is what happens. Feeling happy, almost ecstatic, and inspired by the music she had just heard, Alejandra began to play. The images of the Mediterranean Sea from the morning tour and the flamenco dancers at the cafe merged together in one image in her mind. To her, the dancers seemed like peacocks moving about the floor, dancing a siguria dance with their castanets, colorful and proud. Her fingers moved slowly at first, improvising until the piece began to take shape. Then the melody and tempo of the composition soon reached a crescendo, and the lively rhythm, full of energy, marked the pace, as if the notes played against the castanets. She played her new composition several times to memorize it until she noticed several people had gathered around her who began clapping their hands. She continued for a few more minutes but felt slightly embarrassed and then stopped playing. A young man yelled out, "Más, más." She smiled and graciously said, "Muchas gracias." But moments later, she got up and met her father, who was in the lobby. "Allie, was that something new?" "Yes," she replied. "Do you have a name for it?" "Castanets." So this is what you will hear now, is track 4, and the title piece is Castanets, which is also the title in the book. Every title of every chapter is a title of a musical composition, which gets highlighted at the end.
Sorry again. After the program is over, we'll put the music on. Now, I heard all kinds of things in there. The syncopation, I heard some jazz chords. Tell us a little bit about the composition.
One of the things that that just happens when I sit down to write at the piano, I usually start with a little melody, a few notes, and then that eventually that expands, and then I'm looking for the harmony. But I have to say that the way that I compose is very much ear-based. So it's a very natural thing for me to do it that way. Very ear-based.
Now, who was playing on that, or how many musicians?
Jan is also playing on that, and then he did the arrangements for the guitar as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Let's open it up to questions. If any of you have questions of Roma, please ask them. Terry.
So when you were in the juried show here, what was your art form?
Excuse me. Let me repeat it just for that, because we're filming it. When you were in the juried show, what was your art form?
Visual art. I did some paintings on pastel painting.
You won second place, I think you told me.
Yes.
1994?
1994.
That's wonderful. Steve?
Yeah, I like history. I'm not a great historian, but there's something about waltz, Mexico, and I know there was a connection with Austria. in the 1800s. Is there
Yes,
anything?
absolutely. Yes, we actually had.
Roma,
Yes,
can you repeat the
yes.
question?
I will repeat the question. The question was that there seems to be a connection with waltz and Austria and Mexico. And yes, absolutely. In 1884, 1887 or so, we had an Austrian emperor by the name of Maximilian. It's really an interesting story because he was a good man. He was a good man who perhaps lived at the wrong time and at the wrong place, because this was a time when Mexico had just obtained their independence, and at the time, the French, there was, some political issues, but he brought also a lot of that culture, which then was continued on by Porfirio Diaz a few years later. So, and in fact, if you go to Mexico City, there's still there the Chapultepec Castle, and if you go there, you will find the furniture exactly like Maximilian had it. You will find portraits of him, and he was one of the sons of the Habsburgs family who ruled Europe for 400 years or so. So it's a very fun history because I think Mexico, like the United States, like many countries, have had really a wide range of cultures also coming in, and also, again, influencing the culture, is this mixing of cultures that I think gives us this amazing energy and creativity, at different periods in history.
Well, I think if you listen to Mexican folk music, I hear German polkas.
That too. That was another influence of the Germans.
Accordion and the...
Yes, and that was actually during the time when Texas was still part of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Germans came to that part, and so then they also left the music. And so interestingly enough, the whole polka then now became a lot of the country, Mexican country music is very polka based. I mean, not very. All polka based, which is very, very interesting. So you can see some of the influences that are happening, again, with the various cultures.
Other questions?
Don't be shy.
Well, I'd like to ask one
Richard.
question. Your background is very similar to my grandmother's background. She came to the U.S. in 1902 or 3. Was educated in the U.S., married an American, had 2 children. So I am part Mexican.
Oh, wonderful! Really?
She had a very interesting, rich life here in the U.S. So I just want to also point out that if you look at that era, and for example, take a walk through the law school and look at the faces of the graduates of the law school back then, you will see an increasing number of women, to the point where about half of the law school is women. This is before the Great Depression, when there was a lot of freedom in the world. And among those faces are many Hispanics.
Yeah, and actually, the other things that I discovered when I was doing my research is that some of the first actually Mexicans to come to Minnesota were it was right after World War I, and many of them came to St. Paul. So I mean, obviously, and then of course we had other countries and other people coming from different countries, Sweden and other places, but you had that variety. And that was, I think, what I also wanted to tap into was that multiculturalism that we talk about today, but it's been happening for the last, 200 years or more. I mean, it's been happening all the time.
Well, I'm happy for it because that's why I'm here.
Yes, exactly.
And
That's
we're
wonderful.
happy you're
That's
here.
wonderful.
Steve?
A question about how you do the book. Did you use a CD, but did you have the thoughts, maybe a CD is going to be outdated, maybe I should put barcodes and things like that connect to phones on pages? Did that enter your mind at all?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, it did not. I mean, in fact, the book is available also in e-format. And you can also obtain the music through iTunes. So, but there was something, traditional, perhaps. This is a traditional story, and I thought it was nice to incorporate it, to have the CD. And yes, it might go away. the whole CD technology. But then it's also available. It will be also available on iTunes, so people can still download that if you want, as the book. So,
How much of the story is you? This is a young woman who comes to the U.S. about the same age you did, right?
well, no, because actually the character in the book it's different. A lot of people ask me that, if I'm Alejandra. No, I'm not. Obviously, first of all, Alejandra, no, she was born in Minneapolis. She was born in Minneapolis in 1902. What happens is that because of her mother is Mexican and her father is American. Her father is Edward Stanford. Her mother is Lydia. She goes, she visits her family in Mexico, and she has all this exposure. But the only thing that we have in common, I would say, is music, But obviously, she is very different in terms of her character, and also she is, dreaming of being a symphonic conductor. So she's very driven and very ambitious, and in that way. So it's very different. It's a very different story. Obviously, you sprinkle it, I would say, 50% it's history, another maybe 25% is, 30% is imagination, and maybe 10 to 15, 20% sprinkle with experiences of my own life. But again, very, very different than my life, and very different than me. But I do want to highlight my background as well as other cultures.
Well, sure, and both the character and you have seen two different cultures, and you have a different perspective than someone who's lived only in the U.S.
Yeah.
You bring that out in the book quite well.
Thank you.
Is that one of the reasons you wrote?
Yes, actually, thank you. Thank you for that question, because when I moved here 30 years ago, I really wanted to, writing this book, I always say it's not about me. I had 3 goals in mind. The first one is I wanted to change, or at least change stereotypes, offer alternative perspectives about various cultures. Number 2, I wanted to highlight all the contributions of all cultures through music and the arts, because I feel that when we understand other people's cultures, there is more harmony in the world, there's more harmony among one another, so for me that was also important. And thirdly, I think that we are enriched by being in contact with other cultures, by seeing their art, by hearing their music, by eating their foods. So those were sort of the 3 components that I had in mind to do it, which is why I chose this character. Yes, to be born here in the U.S., be American, but have this sort of richness in her life by having this bicultural exposure. Not just bicultural, multicultural exposure.
Yeah. Well, I thought you did a very good job with all 3 of those goals.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any further questions? We're just about in the back there.
Roma.
Yes.
In being a writer, you get the opportunity to create history.
Yes.
You've talked about how this Alejandra is not you. Are there any instances, however, in the book where you sort of took the opportunity to address an issue or a challenge or perhaps a disappointment in your own life and fix it?
Yes, thank you. That is, you just, you put as they put the finger on the, or I don't know what the expression is, but I think that is the wonderful opportunity that, if you want, that authors have, is to convey certain things. And one of the things that I did want to convey in this story is that it doesn't really matter where you come from, who you are. What matters is what is inside you, what your character is, and what you do with your life. Because I think a lot of times, people, or we tend to perhaps judge or see things from one perspective, and people can accomplish so much even if they come from humble beginnings. Many of the wonderful composers came from humble beginnings. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to convey, is that the possibilities of what we can become as human beings is not limited to where we come from, but it can be created by who we are and what we want to do and our will to do whatever we want to do. So thank you for that. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does and it doesn't. Because I could push it a little more and say, was there anything that was personal for you in terms of the issue that you wish your life had been different, that you were, via Alejandra, able to address and change? At some point in your life when you were forced to turn left and you wanted to turn right, were you able to do that in this book?
Well, one of the things that I would have maybe have loved, it's interesting because I admire the life of a conductor now that I'm really getting into it, particularly for book 2 that I'm almost done writing. I wish I would have had the ambition or the opportunity to become a symphonic conductor. I think that would be amazing, and after all the things. So in a way, it's kind of nice. Okay, I can't do it in my real life, but I can certainly do it. I can certainly do it through this character. But I have to say that came as I was writing the story, because originally, yes, it was my inspiration of what symphonic conductors do. But I think as the more I did the research, the more I realized what an incredible opportunity conductors have, because they have to be well versed. It's amazing the things that they have to know and do to be able to become symphonic conductors. And I thought, what a wonderful thing, especially that you still don't see as many women being symphonic conductors, but you do see there's a few here and there even today. But I guess that would be one of the things that personally, now that I have the know-how, maybe in my next life I'll be.
Okay, another question. Terry, did you have a question?
Do you have any other CDs?
I have another CD, the first one that came out that in 1998, and that was Carnival of Life. And then currently I'm writing new music for the second book, which will be titled A Symphony of Rivals. So we'll see how that goes.
That's wonderful.
And the second book begins, I do want to address that, the second book begins in 1933, Berlin, Germany. So now that's when she gets to go to Germany now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming. Congratulations on wonderful writing and music.
Thank you so much, and thank you again to you and Edina Art Center for being here. Thank you very much.